Lady Eleanor Hartley stood frozen in the doorway of her father's study, her heart pounding so violently she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. The man seated across from her father, the distinguished guest she deliberately dressed down to avoid, had just turned to face her, and his storm-gray eyes held a flicker of recognition that made her breath catch in her throat. Because she knew those eyes. She'd dreamed of them every night for 3 years. But that was impossible. The Duke of Ashford was supposed to be in India, and he certainly wasn't supposed to be here, in her father's study, asking for her hand in marriage. The brown wool gown she wore felt heavier now than it ever had before. She'd chosen it carefully this morning, thinking that the dull, practical fabric would be the safest choice. After all, the last thing she wanted was to draw attention to herself in front of a stranger. But this was no stranger. This was Alexander Ashford, the man who had once held her heart and then disappeared without a word. "Miss Hartley, we meet again," the Duke said, his voice low, the words almost caress. His gaze never left hers, and in that moment, Eleanor could hardly breathe. The years seemed to stretch and collapse into a single, unbearable instant. Her mind spun. The Duke, the man she had loved 3 years ago, the man who had vanished without explanation, he was here, sitting in her father's study, dressed in the sharp, elegant cut of a wealthy gentleman, a man who had certainly not been waiting for her. She had never expected this, never imagined it, and yet there he was, staring at her with a mixture of longing and regret she couldn't decipher. Her father, Lord Hartley, looked between them with confusion, his brow furrowing. "Eleanor, my dear, do you know his grace?" She shook her head sharply, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "No, father," she said, her voice a little too cold, too clipped. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to say. How could she possibly respond to this? The Duke's eyes never left her face. "You might not recognize me, Miss Hartley," he said softly, his tone almost apologetic. "It has been some time." Her fingers curled into the sleeve of her gown, the fabric suddenly feeling like an iron shackle. She wanted to run, to escape, but she could not. She had to stay. She had to hear him out, even though every part of her wanted to scream, to demand an explanation for his silence, his absence. Why had he never written to her? Why had he simply disappeared without a trace? Lord Hartley, completely unaware of the history between them, seemed entirely focused on the business at hand. "His Grace has come with an offer, Eleanor, a proposal, I believe." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced, trying to latch on to some shred of understanding. A proposal? For what? A proposal? She repeated the word with an almost imperceptible tremor in her voice, her eyes widening in disbelief. A proposal for what, father? She glanced back at the Duke, unable to hide the sharpness in her tone now. What kind of proposal? The Duke's lips twitched into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was something far more guarded, something she couldn't quite place. He straightened, his broad shoulders squared, and for a moment, the space between them seemed to stretch longer than it should have. "A marriage proposal, Miss Hartley. For you." The world tilted sideways. The words felt like they had been carved into stone, impossible to move, yet too heavy to ignore. Eleanor's hands, still clutching the fabric of her gown, felt cold and clammy. She struggled to breathe, her lungs tight in her chest. He cannot be serious. This is some mistake. She opened her mouth to protest, to ask him why. Why now? Why here? But no words came. Her mind refused to form the question. Her thoughts swirled in chaos, caught in the fog of confusion and pain. The Duke's voice broke through the haze. "I know what you must think of me," he said, his expression softening, the shadows of regret flitting across his face. "But I can explain everything. If you'll give me 1 hour of your time, I can make you understand why I never wrote." Eleanor stiffened, her face pale. An hour? Her thoughts raced. 3 years had passed in silence. 3 long years. And now, after all that time, he was asking for an hour of her time? What could he possibly say to explain away the pain, the silence, the betrayal? The ache in her chest, the hurt she had buried deep inside her, suddenly burst forth like a dam breaking. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much she had suffered, how deeply his absence had cut into her. But her voice remained locked, her throat tight with the weight of her emotions. Her father, sensing the growing tension, turned to the Duke. "If you wish to speak with her, my lord, you must understand that this is a delicate matter. Eleanor, you must listen to what the Duke has to say. Perhaps there is more to this than we know." Eleanor glanced at her father, his face drawn in worry. The financial troubles that had haunted their family were no secret. But this was not a part of her father's debts, nor was it something Eleanor had ever imagined. The Duke of Ashford, the very man she had once dreamed of marrying, was standing before her, asking for her hand as though nothing had changed. As the Duke stood, the faint rustling of his coat reminded Eleanor of the way he used to walk beside her in the gardens of London. 3 years ago, everything had seemed possible. But now, standing in her father's study, everything felt like it had been ripped from its foundation, and Eleanor was left to pick up the broken pieces. "I'm not sure I can," her voice faltered, and she stopped, swallowing hard, trying to fight back the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. You left, without a word, without a letter. I waited for you, Duke. For 2 years, I waited, and now you come back with a proposal as though nothing happened." The Duke's gaze softened, and Eleanor's heart twisted in response. He looked as though her words had struck him deeply, yet there was no denying the deep resolve in his eyes. The sadness was still there, mingled with something else she couldn't quite read. Was it regret, or was it something more? "I never meant to hurt you," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "But please, Eleanor, allow me to explain. I owe you that much." Eleanor looked away, tears threatening to break free. She could not, would not, cry in front of him. Not now, not after all this time. But as the Duke continued, as he stood before her, a man broken by the weight of his own past, Eleanor realized she had no choice but to listen. There was something unfinished between them, something that had to be said, no matter how much it hurt. But the question remained, was it too late? Had he truly come back for her, or was this just another reminder of love that had already been lost? The Duke stepped closer, his voice earnest. "If you'll give me that hour, I promise you will understand. I never stopped thinking about you, Eleanor. I never stopped loving you." And with that, everything froze. "I know what you must think of me," the Duke said, his voice low. "But I can explain everything. If you'll give me 1 hour of your time, I can make you understand why I never wrote." 3 years earlier, during the height of the London season in 1811, Eleanor had been a different woman. She was 18, brimming with youthful hope and naivety. Caught in the whirl of dances and garden parties, her heart open and unguarded. She had never imagined that someone like Duke Alexander Ashford, newly titled, impossibly handsome, and an heir to a vast fortune, could even spare a thought for someone like her. But he had. Their meeting had been as unexpected as it was electrifying. It had been at a garden party hosted by her family, one of those glittering affairs where the cream of society mingled under the soft glow of lanterns and the sweet scent of roses. She had been standing alone near the fountain, feeling oddly out of place amid the elegantly dressed ladies and gentlemen, when he had appeared. Their first words had been innocent enough, something about the weather, perhaps, or the garden's roses. But it hadn't mattered. She was captivated from the moment his dark eyes had met hers. He had a quiet intensity about him, a calm that drew her in. They had spoken of poetry, books, and ideas, the kind of conversations Eleanor had always craved, though they seemed so out of place in the world of the aristocracy. As the days passed, their meetings became more frequent. They would find each other at parties, walking side by side in the garden, exchanging glances in the ballroom, laughing at some shared joke. Each stolen conversation had deepened her affection for him. It had been effortless, natural. For 3 weeks, Eleanor had allowed herself to believe in the possibility of love. The weeks had been a whirlwind of dances and stolen moments, a dream she had never wanted to end. Alexander had been kind, attentive, and unlike anyone she had ever met. They had shared private talks about their childhoods, their hopes for the future, and their shared love for literature and philosophy. He had made her feel seen, heard, as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. She had never been more certain of her feelings for him, and though he hadn't overtly declared his own affection, She knew it was mutual. But life, as it so often did, intervened. Just as Eleanor had begun to imagine a future with him, Alexander had informed her that he was leaving for India to manage his family's business. The announcement had been sudden, and she had struggled to mask her disappointment, her heart sinking as he spoke of his plans. "It will only be 2 years, Eleanor," he had said, his eyes searching hers, almost pleading for her understanding. 2 years, and then I will return. I ask that you wait for me. I promise I will write." He had looked at her with such intensity, such quiet desperation, that Eleanor had agreed without hesitation. She had promised to wait. She had believed in him, in the bond they had formed, and for a time it had been enough. She had eagerly awaited his letters, counting the days until they would arrive. The first few months had been filled with hope. She had worn a smile whenever a messenger arrived, her pulse quickening with the anticipation of a letter bearing his name. But weeks turned into months, and the letters never came. No word, no sign of him, no explanation. It was as though he had vanished entirely. She had waited through the first year, her hope unwavering, telling herself that the delay was simply due to the distance, the uncertainty of travel in those days. But as the second year passed with no word, doubt began to creep in. Her heart began to break, little by little, as she realized that his promise had been empty. She had convinced herself that he had forgotten her, that he had moved on, that perhaps his feeling for her had been nothing more than a passing infatuation. She had tried to move on, to push the memories of their time together into the recesses of her mind, but it had been impossible. No matter how much she tried to occupy herself with other pursuits, his absence had been a constant ache in her chest, a reminder of what could have been. The silence had been deafening. And then one day, after what had felt like an eternity, the news had come that Alexander's father had died. The family estate had fallen into disarray, and Alexander had been forced to spend the last 2 years working tirelessly to restore it, to rebuild what had been lost. He had returned a man transformed, darker, more serious, burdened by the weight of responsibility. He had returned to a world that had changed, and he had found Eleanor, standing here, in front of him, still holding on to the fragments of the past. Her heart had been in turmoil. She had spent the past 3 years convincing herself that she had moved on, that she had grown, that she had learned to live without him. But now, seeing him again, it felt as though time had not passed at all. The same rush of feeling she had tried so hard to bury rose within her. The truth was, she had never stopped loving him, not truly, but her pride, her hurt, had built walls around her heart. She could not let him in again so easily, not after everything. "Why did you never write?" she asked him, her voice tight with both anger and sorrow, her hands clenched in fists at her sides. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of emotion she had not allowed herself to feel for so long. The Duke's face softened, his eyes narrowing as though her question had struck him to his core. "I did write," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I wrote to you every month, Eleanor. 37 letters. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't speak. 37 letters? She repeated, her mind struggling to process the words. But they never arrived. They never came. She shook her head, the confusion swirling inside her. Why? The Duke's gaze flickered with pain, and he took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. The letters were returned, unopened. Each one, sent with the greatest of care, came back to me as if they had never been delivered. He paused, and Eleanor could see the anger, the hurt, simmering just beneath the surface. I searched for answers. I tried to find out why. It wasn't until recently that I discovered the truth. Someone had kept the letters from you. Someone who wanted us apart. The world seemed to tilt under Eleanor's feet. Her mind reeled as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The silence, the pain, it wasn't his fault. It had never been his fault. He had tried to reach her, and it had been someone else who had kept them apart. Who? She demanded, her voice rising in disbelief. Who could have done such a thing? The Duke's eyes hardened, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she saw the flicker of regret, of deep-seated pain, pass across his face. It was your stepmother, he said quietly. After your father remarried, I learned that your stepmother had been intercepting the letters, keeping them from you. She wanted to keep you available for a different match. She knew I was interested in you, and she did everything in her power to ensure that we would never be together." Eleanor staggered back, her mind reeling from the revelation. The woman who had come into their lives so quickly after her mother's death. The woman who had always treated her with a thinly veiled disdain. She was the one who had torn her heart apart, who had caused the years of silence and suffering. The woman who had kept her from the man she loved. Anger, sharp and sudden, flared inside her. "My stepmother?" she whispered, her voice shaking. But why?" The Duke's eyes softened, and he took another step closer, as though he could offer her comfort. "Because she thought it was for the best. She believed that she could secure a more advantageous match for you, one that would benefit your family. She saw me as a distraction, a complication." His voice was filled with bitterness. "But I never forgot you, Eleanor. I never stopped thinking of you. And now, I've come to make things right. I've come to offer you the future we should have had, the one that was stolen from us." Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, and though her heart still ached with the memory of the years she had spent waiting, there was something else there now, something softer, a flicker of hope. Could it really be true? Could he have never stopped caring for her? Could everything that had happened, his absence, his silence, really have been out of his hands? She wanted to believe it, wanted to let herself believe that the love they had shared in those stolen moments was still there, waiting to be reclaimed. But could she? Could she open her heart again after everything? "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need time." The Duke nodded, his expression solemn. "I understand, but I'm not going anywhere. I'll wait for as long as it takes." The weight of the past 3 years pressed down on Eleanor as she turned away, her heart torn between what was and what could be. The future felt impossibly unclear, but for the first time in so long, she felt as though it might be within her reach. The question was, would she dare to take it? Every letter returned unopened. The Duke continued, his jaw tight with old pain. "And then I learned the truth. Someone deliberately kept them from you. Someone who wanted us apart." The Duke's story had been a revelation, one that shook Eleanor to her core. As she stood there, her heart heavy with a mix of emotions, anger, hurt, confusion, but also something else, something that she could not quite name. She realized that the years she had spent in sorrow, waiting for a letter that never came, were not as simple as she had thought. The Duke had loved her. He had promised a return, and had he not been swept away by misfortune, perhaps he would have. But life, as it often does, had intervened. His father's sudden death, the collapse of the family estate, the business crisis that followed, all of it had left him no choice but to stay away longer than he had ever intended. Eleanor's mind raced as she tried to absorb everything he had just told her. A shipwreck off the coast of Bengal, a near-fatal illness in a remote village, letters that were lost in the wreck, and then a frantic return to England, only to find that the estate was in ruins and there was little left of the life he had once known. She had been unaware of the gravity of his situation, of how far he had fallen, of the sacrifices he had made to rebuild his family's name. She had assumed that his silence had been a simple case of indifference, that he had chosen not to write because his feeling for her had faded, or that he had found someone else. But now she understood it had been the world, not his heart, that had kept him from her. "I spent 6 months recovering from the shipwreck," he said, his voice barely a whisper, as if the memory still haunted him. "I was in a remote village, near death. When I finally recovered, I received word that my father had passed. The news came too late." His jaw tightened as he spoke, the weight of his grief still evident even after all these years. "By the time I returned, everything was in ruins. The estate, the family fortune, it was all gone. I had no choice but to devote myself to rebuilding it. For 2 years, I worked tirelessly, every penny I earned going towards saving the family name, paying off debts, trying to salvage what I could." He paused, clearly struggled with the words. "And in all that time, I thought of you, every day, but there was no way to contact you, no way to reach you." Eleanor felt the weight of his words, but the confusion inside her deepened. "But why didn't you try harder?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you come to me sooner? You had the means. You could have come to London. You could have written again or sent someone to find me. He shook his head, a look of deep regret crossing his face. I tried. I wrote to you. 37 letters, Eleanor. 37. And each one was returned unopened. At first, I thought it was a mistake, that the letters had gotten lost in transit. But when I went to your estate in London, I discovered the truth. Someone had deliberately kept them from you. His words were like a slap to her face, and for a moment, Eleanor could only stare at him, unable to fully comprehend the gravity of what he was saying. Someone had kept his letters from her? Someone had kept them from reaching her, from giving her the chance to hear his side of the story? Her mind whirled as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The anger she had felt over his silence, the hurt she had carried for so long, now felt misplaced, misdirected. But who could have done such a thing? Who would have gone to such lengths to keep them apart? The answer came swiftly, cutting through confusion like a knife. It was my stepmother, wasn't it? She said, her voice trembling with the realization. The Duke nodded, his expression darkening. Yes, he said quietly. Your stepmother. I didn't know it at the time, but when I finally discovered the truth, I went to your father and learned everything. She had intercepted the letters, keeping them from you. She wanted you to be available for another match, someone with more wealth, more power. She saw me as an obstacle to that. Eleanor staggered back, her heart pounding in her chest as a wave of fury surged through her. Her stepmother, the woman who had entered their home not long after her mother's death, the woman who had always treated her with condescension, who had tried to control her every move. She had been the one to keep Eleanor and the Duke apart. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow, and Eleanor's fists clenched at her sides as the anger burned within her. She had spent years thinking that Alexander had abandoned her, that he had simply stopped caring. And now, she learned that the real culprit was someone she had trusted, someone who had turned her pain into something selfish, something manipulative. Why? She asked, her voice cracking as the full weight of it hit her. Why would she do that? Why would she want to keep us apart? The Duke sighed deeply, looking almost as though he was carrying a burden too heavy to bear. I can't say for certain, but I believe she wanted you to marry someone else, someone with more influence, more wealth, someone who would secure your family position. She never thought I was good enough for you. Eleanor shook her head, trying to process everything. She had always known that her stepmother had certain ambitions, that she had seen her marriage to her father as a way to advance her own position, but she had never imagined that the woman would go to such lengths to manipulate her life. Her life. The truth was, Eleanor had been a pawn in someone else's game, a pawn she had never even known was being played. She felt as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath her. Everything she had believed about the past 3 years, the pain, the waiting, the emptiness, had been a lie. Alexander had not forgotten her. He had never stopped thinking about her. And now, standing before her, he was offering her the very future she had dreamed of. But could she trust him again? Could she forgive him for the years of silence, for the absence that had left a scar on her heart? And now, she asked, her voice barely a whisper, what happens now? You found me. You've told me your story. But what does that mean for us? The Duke's expression softened and he stepped closer, his voice steady but filled with emotion. What it means, Eleanor, is that I'm here now. I've spent these years trying to rebuild everything, but I've never stopped thinking of you. I've never stopped hoping that one day we might have a future together. Eleanor felt the weight of his words, and though her heart was still filled with hurt, she couldn't ignore the flicker of hope that stirred within her. Perhaps it was foolish to hope for a second chance after everything that had happened. Perhaps it was naive to believe that they could simply pick up where they had left off. But in that moment, standing there with him, hearing his words, Eleanor realized that she wanted to try. She wanted to believe in the love they had shared, the love that had been stolen from them. She wanted to believe in a future with him, despite everything that had come before. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said, her voice trembling as she spoke. I don't know if I can let go of all the pain, the years I spent waiting for you. He nodded, his face filled with understanding. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Eleanor, he said softly. I know that I hurt you, and I can never take that away. But I'm here now, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that my love for you was never a lie. Eleanor felt tears sting the corners of her eyes, But she didn't cry. Instead, she stood there, her heart heavy with the weight of the past, yet filled with something else, something that resembled hope. The road ahead would be long, and it would be difficult, but for the first time in 3 years, she felt as though she might have a chance at happiness. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin again. "There's something I must show you," the Duke said, pulling a worn leather journal from his coat. "Something I've carried with me every day since we parted. After you see this, you'll understand why I never stopped searching for you." The air in the room was heavy with unspoken words, the weight of the past pressing down on Eleanor as the Duke reached into his coat and produced a small, worn leather journal. He held out to her, his hands trembling slightly as though the mere act of unveiling it was a release of something long held inside him. Eleanor looked at it, unsure what to expect. The journal was aged, its cover scuffed and faded from years of use, and the moment her fingers brushed against it, she felt a strange shiver run through her. She didn't take it at once, her gaze still locked with the Duke's. His expression was serious, almost pleading. "This," he said softly, "has been with me since the day we parted. Since I left London for India, this journal became the only connection I had to you. Every page holds the thoughts, the hopes, the dreams I had for our future. And in those dark moments, when I thought I had lost everything, it was the thought of you, of what we shared, that kept me going. Please, Eleanor, read it. It's the only way I can make you understand why I never stopped searching for you." The words seemed to echo in her mind, and she felt a lump form her throat. It was hard to believe, hard to comprehend that after all these years, after everything she had endured, he had kept something so deeply personal for her. She hesitated for a moment before taking the journal, her fingers brushing the leather once more as she carefully opened it. The first pages were filled with hurried writing, as though he had written them in the midst of a storm. She skimmed over the words, catching glimpses of thoughts that were raw, vulnerable, entries that spoke of his grief, his longing, his determination to return to her. His handwriting was neat, elegant, but the words were full of anguish. "The first letter I wrote to you after I arrived in India," he had written on one page, "was filled with optimism. I thought I would write to you every month, each letter a promise that I would return. But soon I was consumed by the demands of my father's business, and then the shipwreck came. I lost everything, and all I could think about was you. I thought of you every day, Eleanor, in that desolate village. When I was so close to dying, the only thing that kept me alive was the thought that one day I would return to you." She closed her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the pain in his words, the depth of his devotion. And there, on the next page, was a description of a place she knew all too well, the garden where they had first met, the one they had walked through together in the quiet of the evenings. He had written about it as though it were a sanctuary, a place where he felt truly at peace, a place where he could imagine a future. "If only you knew how I spent my days walking through that garden in my mind," he had written. "Every flower, every tree reminded me of you. I would close my eyes and pretend I was back in London, back in the world where everything was perfect, where you were waiting for me." Eleanor's heart ached, the quiet sorrow of his words washing over her. He had been lost, stranded in a foreign land, clinging to memory of her like a lifeline, all the while she had believed him to be indifferent, moving on without her. The journal was filled with such entries, some written in moments of hope, others in moments of despair. He had written about his recovery, about the days when he had been bedridden, about the pain of waiting for the news of his father's death. But through it all, there was one constant. His thoughts were always with her. The more Eleanor read, the more she could feel the bond between them stretching across the distance of those years. It was as though the very act of reading his words was bridging the gap, pulling her back into a world she had long abandoned, into a life that had once been so full of promise. But as she read, she also began to understand the true depth of his feelings. Each entry was a testament to his loyalty, his unwavering commitment to her, and his pain at the distance that had separated them. One page caught her eye, and she paused to read it more carefully. "I've had an artist make a portrait of her," he had written, his words almost casual but still filled with love. "It's not much, just a sketch, but it's all I can hold on to until I return. I hope one day, when we are reunited, she will see this and know how I've carried her image with me all these years. Eleanor turned the page slowly, her fingers trembling. There, sketched in charcoal, was her face. The portrait was not perfect. No artist could capture the true essence of her, but it was enough to make her breath catch in her throat. The eyes were hers, the smile, though faint, was unmistakable. It was a likeness, a piece of her captured in his mind. She could see the love in every line, every stroke, every detail. It was a love that had been kept alive through the hardships of years apart. And it was this love, this constant, unbroken thread, that had held him together, that had driven him to come back for her, to seek her out after everything that had happened. Her fingers brushed the page, and she felt something shift within her. The anger, the hurt, the confusion, all of it began to fade, replaced by a quiet realization. He had never stopped loving her. He had never forgotten her. He had carried her with him, in his heart, for 3 long years. And she had been the one to believe the worst, to assume that his silence meant indifference. The weight of guilt settled over her, but it was quickly replaced by something else, something softer. It was forgiveness. "You've carried this with you?" she asked quietly, lifting her eyes in the journal to meet his gaze. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "Every day. I never stopped thinking about you, Eleanor. Not once." She closed the journal, her hand shaking slightly as she set it down on the table between them. She didn't know what to say. How could she put into words what she was feeling? The ache in her heart, the swelling of emotion she had locked away for so long, now threatened to overwhelm her. She was torn between the pain of the past and the hope of the future. Could she trust him again? Could she open her heart to him after everything that had happened? And yet, as she sat there, looking at the journal that had been his companion for so long, she realized that she already knew the answer. He had never stopped loving her. And perhaps, just perhaps, she had never stopped loving him either. The truth was, it was never too late for love. It never had been. "I don't know how to make sense of all of this," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "It feels like too much, too fast." The Duke reached across the table, his hand brushing hers gently. "I don't expect you to understand everything at once, Eleanor. I know I've asked a lot of you, but I'll wait for as long as it takes. I'll wait for you to find your way back to me." His words, simple but sincere, made her heart flutter. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that they could have a future together, despite everything that had come before. But could they really? Could they rebuild what had been lost? She didn't know, but she was willing to find out. "I need to think," Eleanor whispered, clutching the journal to her chest. "This is too much. My heart, my duty, my pride, all at war. Give me until morning." But she knew morning might be too late. The creditors would arrive at dawn. Eleanor sat in her room long after the Duke had left, the journal still clutched tightly in her hands. She had barely touched her supper, her thoughts too consumed by everything he had revealed to her. The storm of emotions inside her was overwhelming, and no matter how hard she tried to focus, she couldn't shake the image of his face, so full of pain and hope as he had shared the story of his past. The weight of his love for her was now undeniable, yet so were the years of hurt and silence. She had spent those years believing that he had abandoned her, that his silence meant he had moved on and forgotten her. But now, learning that he had never stopped thinking of her, that he had kept every letter and every promise in heart, made her question everything she thought she knew. Her fingers ran over the worn leather of the journal again, her thoughts in turmoil. How could I have been so wrong? She thought. How could I have doubted him when he had never stopped caring? But even as the guilt gnawed at her, another part of her, the part that had always been afraid of her own heart, felt a flicker of hope. Could she really forgive him? Could she really open herself to him again after all this time? The questions churned in her mind, refusing to quiet. Her fingers brushed against a brown wool gown hanging in her wardrobe. She had chosen it earlier that morning with the intent of hiding from hope, dressing in a way that would shield her heart from any vulnerability. But now, standing before the gown, she wondered if it was more than just a shield. It had become armor, something to protect her from the very feelings she had tried so hard to bury. She had worn it for so long, a symbol of her fear and her rejection of the idea of love. But now, standing on the edge of a decision that could change everything, she realized that the gown no longer offered her protection it once had. It had become a symbol of her own reluctance to embrace what her heart had always known. She loved him. She couldn't deny it any longer. The love she had for him, the love that had never truly faded, was still there, buried beneath layers of hurt and pride. But could she take the step toward him now? Could she take the risk of loving him again? She paced the room, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Her father's troubles were a constant weight on her mind, and the creditors would arrive at dawn. He had told her that he could help, that he would settle the debts if she agreed to marry him. But she had resisted, even as a part of her wanted to say yes, to accept his offer. But the thought of marriage, the thought of binding herself to him again, was daunting. She had been hurt before, and the idea of giving him her heart again, after everything that had happened, seemed impossible. The future seemed too uncertain, and the way of her family's financial ruin only made it harder to think clearly. Could she really marry him for love? She had dreamed of it, of course, but reality was never as simple as a dream. The brown gown mocked her from the corner of the room, a reminder of protection she had always sought from the world and from her own feelings. The fabric, plain and unassuming, had been her armor, but now, in the quiet solitude of her room, she saw it differently. It wasn't just a shield, it was a barrier, and she was the one who had built it. The gown that had once made her feel safe now felt like a prison, one that kept her from fully embracing what she could have with him. She was afraid. She had been afraid of loving him, afraid of the vulnerability it required, and afraid of the pain she might feel if things went wrong again. But she couldn't live like this forever, hiding behind the walls she had constructed. She had spent too many years in emotional exile, clinging to her pride and her sense of duty. But those things no longer felt as important as they once had. What was duty when it meant sacrificing her heart? She closed her eyes, the decision coming into sharper focus. She didn't need more time to think. She needed to act. The decision had already been made within her heart. She had always known what she wanted, but her fear had held her back. But not anymore. She opened her eyes and looked at the gown again. The brown wool, dull and lifeless, had served its purpose in the past, but now it was time to move forward. She didn't need to hide behind it anymore. She needed to be bold. She needed to choose him. The emerald silk gown, the one the Duke had sent her, was a symbol of everything she had been afraid of, everything that had been denied to her. The gown was beautiful, but it also represented her hesitation, her fear of letting go of the past. But now, standing there, staring at the brown wool, Eleanor knew that she had to make a choice. The brown gown had been her shield, her protection, but it was time to let it go. She was ready to be vulnerable. She was ready to love him, despite the fear that still clung to her. Slowly, with trembling hands, Eleanor reached for the emerald silk gown. She held it in her hand for a moment, feeling the softness of the fabric, the promise it represented. But then, with a quiet resolve, she set it aside. She didn't need it. She didn't need to hide behind something beautiful, to show the world who she was. She needed to be herself. She needed to face the future with the same courage that had once led her to believe in love, to believe in him. With one final glance at the brown wool gown, Eleanor walked toward the door. She would face her father. She would face the Duke. She would face whatever the future held. And whatever happened, she knew it would be better than the life she had been living in fear. She stepped into the corridor, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what the morning would bring, but for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope, a sense of possibility. She was no longer afraid to take the leap. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Eleanor stood before her wardrobe. Her hand hovered between two gowns, the brown wool that protected her heart, and the emerald silk that promised a future. Her choice would tell the Duke everything. As the first rays of dawn broke through the curtains, Eleanor stood before her wardrobe, her heart thudding in her chest. The day had arrived, the day she had been dreading and hoping for all at once. The creditors were on their way, and with them, the crushing weight of her father's financial ruin. The Duke's offer still hung heavy in the air. his promise to settle all of their debts if she would marry him. The brown wool gown, her trusted shield, hung in the wardrobe just as it had the night before, a reminder of everything she had hidden from. Her emotions, her vulnerability, her hopes. The emerald silk gown, the one the Duke had sent her, lay next to it, waiting to be chosen, a symbol of the life she could have as she allowed herself to embrace the possibility of love, of a future she had only dared to dream of. Her hand hovered between the two gowns, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. The brown wool had been her armor for so long, a simple, unassuming choice that allowed her to keep the world and her heart at a distance. But she couldn't hide behind it any longer. She couldn't live in the safety of fear, bound by the walls she had built around herself. Her heart, her true heart, longed for more. It had always longed for more, but she had been too afraid to admit it. The emerald silk, on the other hand, represented everything she had been afraid of. The possibility of love, the vulnerability of opening herself to someone again, the risk of getting hurt. But it also promised something else, a future, a chance of happiness, a life that might be more than mere survival. Could she really let go of her fears? Could she trust the Duke after everything that had happened? She glanced at the brown wool gown once more, its dull, comforting simplicity, and a wave of emotion washed over her. She had worn it as a shield, a way to protect herself from the pain of hope, from the uncertainty of what the future might bring. But now, standing on the precipice of change, she realized it had become a crutch, something that kept her from stepping fully into the life she deserved. The choice before her was not just about gowns. It was about what she was willing to accept for herself, what kind of life she was willing to lead. She had spent so many years hiding from love, from the possibility of happiness, clinging to the idea of duty and responsibility. But now she knew duty alone would not be enough to make her whole. Love, true love, was what she needed. And love, for all its risks and uncertainties, was what she wanted. With a deep breath, she made her decision. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for the brown wool gown, the one that had served her so well for so long, and gently placed it aside. It had protected her, yes, but it had also kept her from living. She no longer needed to hide. She was ready to face the world, to face her future with an open heart. The emerald silk gown, bright and full of promise, now seemed the right choice. She could feel its weight in her hands as she held it against her body, imagining what it would feel like to walk into the drawing room wearing it, to meet the Duke's eyes and see what might happen next. Her breath caught as she thought of him, of the kindness in his eyes, the tenderness in his touch. Despite all the pain of the past, she had never stopped loving him. It had been buried beneath layers of hurt and fear, but it had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. She would wear this gown for herself, for the future she wanted, not the past she had clung to. She could still feel the weight of his words, his confession of love, his promise to never stop searching for her. And as she turned toward the door, preparing to face the day, she knew it was the right choice. The Duke was not offering her a way out of her troubles. He was offering her a chance to live, to love, to embrace a future she had never allowed herself to imagine. And as the sunlight streamed into the window, Eleanor felt her heart open, filled with a quiet but certain hope. She could no longer be afraid. She could no longer hold herself back. She would walk into that drawing room with her head held high, knowing that no matter what happened, she made the choice to live, to love, and to be brave. She would not hide anymore. She would stand before the Duke, and whatever the future held, she would face it with him. She was ready to step into the unknown, to build a life together, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. As she descended the stairs, her heart was steady, her resolve firm. She could hear her father's voice coming from the study, his anxious tone cutting through the silence of the house. The creditors were there. They had arrived, and the moment of truth had come. But Eleanor no longer feared it. She had made her choice. She had chosen love, and with it, she had chosen a future. The brown wool gown may have been her armor, but the emerald silk was her hope. She could hear the faint murmur of voices as she reached the bottom of the stairs, and the Duke's face appeared in her mind. His presence had been a constant in her thoughts since the moment they had met again, and now, as she stood at the threshold of the study, she knew that the time had come. She had to face him, to face her father, and to face the truth of what she had decided. The Duke was waiting for her answer, and this time she would give it to him. She stepped into the study, her gaze locking with the Duke's as she walked toward him, every step filled with purpose. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was no hesitation now. The choice had been made. She was no longer the woman who hid behind a plain brown gown, afraid to embrace the future. She was ready to live it. She was ready to love him. As she came to a stop before him, she spoke the words that had been building in her heart all night. "You asked me to think on your proposal," she said, her voice clear, her eyes unwavering. "And I have thought. I'm wearing this gown because I choose to face the future with you. Yes, I'll marry you, not despite my fears, but with them." The Duke's expression softened, and for a moment, all the pain of the past seemed to fall away. The tension between them broke, and he took a step forward, his hand reaching for hers. "You've made me the happiest man alive," he said, his voice filled with quiet reverence. And in that moment, Eleanor knew that everything had changed. The brown gown had been her shield, her armor, but the emerald silk gown was her future, one she was ready to embrace, wholeheartedly and without fear. "But I have one condition," Eleanor said, as the creditors departed, and her father wept with relief. The Duke turned back to her, willing to grant anything. "Court me properly, for 1 month, so I know this is real, not just rescue." The Duke's eyes widened at Eleanor's request, and for a moment he stood silent, as if he hadn't fully understood what she had asked. His lips parted, but no words came out, only the soft exhalation of breath, as though he were still trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. Eleanor, standing before him in the soft glow of the morning light, could feel the weight of his gaze, could feel the hope and love radiating from him in a way that both comforted and overwhelmed her. She had given him her answer, and though it had not come without its own turmoil, she knew it was the right decision. But she wasn't ready to leap into marriage with him. Not yet, not before she had seen the truth of his feelings. Not before she knew that he truly loved her for who she was, and not just because he had come to her rescue. It wasn't about the wealth or the creditors, the debts or the desperation. It was about love, and she needed to know, truly know, that the love he spoke was real, that was not born of obligation, not born of necessity. She had been alone for so long, her heart buried beneath layers of hurt and fear, and she would not rush into a future without being certain that it was the right one, that it was based on something real and lasting. "Court me properly," she said again, her voice steady now, her resolve clear. "For 1 month, I want to know that you are not only offering me your help, but your heart. I want to see you, truly see you, and I want you to see me, not just the woman who will save your family from ruin, but the woman you fell in love with. We need to rebuild something together. Alexander, something that is more than just a solution to a problem." The Duke blinked, clearly taken aback by her request, but then, to Eleanor's surprise, his lips curled into a smile, one of warmth, affection, and, above all, respect. He took her hands in his fingers brushing over hers, and for a moment they stood in silence, the connection between them palpable. "If that is what you need," he said softly, his voice filled with both admiration and understanding, "then I will give you what you ask. 1 month. I will court you in every way a gentleman should, with patience, with respect, and with the deepest affection. I promise, Eleanor, I will prove to you that my feelings for you are true, and that I want nothing more than to spend my life with you." Eleanor's heart fluttered at his words, and for the first time in years, she felt something other than fear and doubt. She felt the stirrings of hope. She could do this. She could let herself be courted by him, and in the process, she would learn to trust him again, learn to trust herself. The month ahead would not be easy, she knew that, but it would be necessary for both of them. Over the next week, the courtship began slowly, with small gestures, tender and cautious. Every morning, the Duke arrived at her father's estate, his smile bright and genuine, his eyes full of affection as he greeted her. He brought her flowers, white lilies, roses, and violets, gifts that spoke of his admiration for her and his desire to see her happy. He asked her questions about her life, about her thoughts, her dreams, and he listened intently to every word she said. There were no grand declarations, no rushing into promises of forever, just quiet moments shared between them, moments that allowed them to rebuild their connection brick by brick. On the second day of their courtship, the Duke suggested they take a walk through the garden, the one they had once wandered together all those years ago in London. The path was familiar, but the air between them was different now. There was a new tension, a new understanding. As they walked side by side, their footsteps echoing softly on the gravel path, they spoke of the past, of the days when they had been strangers to one another, of the fleeting moments that had meant so much. The Duke spoke of the time he had spent in India, his struggles to rebuild his family's estate, the sacrifices he made, and the love he had never stopped feeling for her. "It was in that village," he said quietly, his eyes distant as though he were lost in the memory, "when I was lying in that bed, barely clinging to life, that I made a promise to myself. I promised that I would return to you, that I would never stop searching for you, that I would not rest until I could see you again. I didn't know how or when or even if I would make it back, but I knew I had to. You were the reason I survived. Eleanor, your memory kept me going." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and she reached out to touch his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin to the fabric of his coat. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know that you had suffered so much. I thought you had forgotten me. I thought you had moved on, that you had left me behind." The Duke turned to face her, his expression softening, his hands reaching out to cup her face. "I could never forget you," he said, his voice low and full of sincerity. "You are the one constant in my life, the one thing that never changed, no matter how far I was from you. I loved you then, and I love you now." Her heart trembled at his words, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe in them. She allowed herself to believe in him. The next week brought more moments of quiet connection. They took long carriage rides to the countryside, their conversations growing deeper as they shared their hopes for the future. Eleanor spoke of her father's financial troubles, of the strain it had placed on her and her family, but she also spoke of her own dreams of a life that was not defined by duty or fear, but by love. The Duke listened intently, offering gentle reassurances, but never pushing her to open up more than she was ready to. One afternoon, they visited Ashford Manor, the Duke's family estate. It was grand and imposing, yet there was a warmth to it that took Eleanor by surprise. The staff greeted him with obvious affection, and Eleanor could see that the Duke was loved and respected by all who knew him. As they walked through the halls, he showed her the nursery, where a small crib stood at the center of the room, surrounded by soft linens and blankets. "I had this prepared for you," he said quietly, his voice filled with a tenderness that she had never seen before. "For the day when you would come back to me." Eleanor's heart swelled, and for the first time in their courtship, she saw him as more than just a man who had come to save her family. She saw him as a man who had loved her from afar, who had always been there, even when she hadn't known it. As they continued their walk to the estate, Eleanor saw something else that struck her deeply, a wall in one of the private rooms, covered in letters. 37 letters, each one sealed with care, each one sent with love, each one returned unopened. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Her heart skipped a beat. "You kept them all?" she asked, her voice shaking as she approached the wall. "You never gave up on me." The Duke nodded, his eyes soft with emotion. "I never stopped writing to you. I never stopped trying to reach you." The realization struck Eleanor with full force, and her breath caught in her throat. This was the man she had loved, the man who had never stopped loving her. Even when she had thought him lost, he had never given up on her. And now, as they stood together, in a place that could have been a future they might have had all along, Eleanor realized that her heart, too, had never truly given up on him. Over the next 2 weeks, their relationship blossomed, each day bringing them closer. They shared quiet dinners, long talks, and stolen moments of tenderness, each one deepening their bond. Eleanor found herself growing more and more at ease with him, her fears and doubts slowly melting away. She had never truly doubted his love for her, but now, as she looked into his eyes, she saw the truth of his feelings, the depth of his commitment, and the promise of a future together. Their courtship, though simple, was everything Eleanor had ever wanted. Genuine, respectful, and full of care. By the end of the month, Eleanor knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that her heart had found its home. But there was one more test she had to face, one more thing she needed to know. And she was about to ask him the question that had been on her mind from the very beginning. "Don't," Eleanor said, placing her fingers on the Duke's lips as he began to kneel. "Not yet. There's something I need to do first. Something I should have done 3 years ago if I'd been brave enough." The evening air was cool and crisp as Eleanor stood at the edge of the garden, her gaze sweeping over the vast expanse of Ashford Manor's grounds. She had spent the last few weeks wrapped in the quiet comfort of the Duke's presence, each day filled with new discoveries about the man who had once captured her heart and had never truly let it go. The Duke had courted her in every way imaginable, respecting her space, listening to her, and above all, making her feel like she was the only woman in the world. Their connection had deepened with each passing day, and Eleanor found herself surrendering to the love that had never fully faded, to the love that was at last being returned in full. She knew, without a doubt, that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with him. But there was one final step that she needed to take, one final decision that would seal her future, not just for herself, but for the family they would one day build together. As she turned, the sound of soft footsteps approached, and she knew who it was before she even looked. The Duke had been a constant presence in her life since their reunion, and yet each time he neared, the flutter in her chest remained. The time had come. Eleanor turned to face him, her heart thumping in her chest. Alexander Ashford, standing tall and handsome as ever, was looking at her with the same affection, the same intensity that had always drawn her to him. His eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams for years, were now filled with quiet hope. He had waited for this moment for so long. She could see it in the way he held himself, on the edge of his own anticipation, his breath held in expectation of her answer. He had never wavered, never doubted, even when it seemed as though the distance between them was insurmountable. Now, with the promise of future ahead, they both stood at the precipice of something new. She had made her decision. She would marry him. She would step into this future with him. Despite the fears that still tugged at her heart, despite the scars left by the years of silence, she could feel the weight of her own emotions, the vulnerability that had once been so foreign to her. It was time to embrace it all, the love, the fear, the uncertainty, and allow herself to be vulnerable in the way she had never been before. "Eleanor," the Duke said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "you have made me the happiest man alive. All I have ever wanted, all I have ever dreamed of, is to spend my life with you, to build something together, something that is not just about duty or obligation, but about love. You are everything I have ever wanted, and more. Will you marry me?" The words, so simple and yet so profound, hung in the air between them. His expression was earnest, his love evident in every line of his face, every soft breath that escaped his lips. The pain, the longing, the years of separation, they were all wrapped in that single question. Eleanor felt her heart swell as she looked at him, her mind flashing back to the days of their courtship, to the moments when she had allowed herself to believe in them again. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, but with him, those walls had crumbled. She had learned to trust again, to let go of the fear that had held her back. Now, standing before him, the only thing that remained was the final step. She would take it. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you, not despite my fears, but with them, not despite my doubts, but because I love you and because I believe in us." A look of pure joy lit up his face, and before she could even take another breath, he stepped forward, his arms enveloping her in a warm, tight embrace. It was everything she had imagined, and yet nothing she had expected. This moment, this simple, perfect moment, was theirs. It was not about wealth or status, not about duty or obligation, but about love. Real, true love. And for the first time in so long, Eleanor allowed herself to truly feel it. She held him close, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You've made me the happiest man on earth," the Duke said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you." Eleanor smiled against his chest, feeling a warmth spread through her that had been absent for so long. She didn't need any more promises. She already knew everything she needed to know. The rest of their lives would be built on this, on trust, on love, and on the quiet certainty that they were meant to be together. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of preparations, excitement, and a little bit of nervousness. Ashford Manor, once filled with the quiet echoes of an uncertain future, now hummed with life and joy. Eleanor's father, still struggling with the weight of their family's financial troubles, had been hesitant at first about the marriage, unsure of the cost, unsure of the future. But when he saw the way the Duke treated his daughter, with such affection, such devotion, he had relented, and with that, the house had been filled with a sense of hope. The wedding itself was a quiet affair, one that spoke more to the love they shared than to the pomp and circumstance of high society. Eleanor chose to wear the brown wool gown, the same one she had worn when the Duke first arrived at her father's estate. It was a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. The gown, which had once served as her armor, now seemed the perfect symbol of everything they had overcome. She was not the same woman who had once hidden behind it. She was stronger, braver, and ready to face whatever came next. When she walked down the aisle, the Duke's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, the rest of the world disappeared. All that mattered was him, and the promise of a future together. Her father, standing at her side, could hardly contain his tears as he escorted her to the altar. The years of hardship, the weight of the family's troubles, seemed to fade in that moment, and Eleanor felt a sense of peace wash over her. It didn't matter that they had faced so many obstacles, so many challenges. What mattered was that they had found their way back to each other. As the vows were exchanged, Eleanor looked into the Duke's eyes and saw everything she had ever dreamed of. Love, commitment, the promise of forever. I vow to love you, to honor you, to cherish you, for all my days, the Duke said, his voice thick with emotion. You are my heart, Eleanor, and I will never stop loving you. And as Eleanor repeated the words, her heart full and her soul at peace, she knew that this was the beginning of something beautiful, something lasting. This was a love she had always wanted, the love she had once feared, the love that would carry her through whatever trials life might bring. Their first kiss as husband and wife was a quiet moment, a moment of pure joy. It was not about passion or grand gestures, but about the simple truth that they had made it through the darkness, and now they could finally walk into the light together. The reception at Ashford Manor was a celebration of love, of family, and of new beginnings. Laughter echoed through the halls as guests danced, ate, and shared stories of the couple's courtship, of the way they had come together despite the odds. The night was full of joy, but for Eleanor and the Duke, it was the quiet moments that meant the most. The moments when they stood side by side, hand in hand, knowing that they had found something rare and beautiful in each other. Later that night, as they retired to their chambers, the Duke turned to Eleanor, his eyes filled with tenderness. There's one more thing, he said, his voice soft. A gift for you, my love. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a sapphire ring, the stone sparkling in the dim light. I had this made for you, he said, his voice low and filled with emotion. It was sized to fit you perfectly, based on your glove measurements. I want you to wear it always, as a reminder of my love, of our promise. Eleanor's breath caught as she looked at the ring. It was perfect, the deep blue of the sapphire reflecting the light like a piece of the sky itself. She slipped it onto her finger, feeling the weight of it, the promise it represented. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. They were a family now, a team, bound not just by love, but by everything they had survived to reach this point. She leaned in and kissed him, her heart full of joy, of peace, of the quiet certainty that this was where she was meant to be. I love you, she whispered. I always will. And I love you, the Duke replied, his voice thick with emotion. Always. The night ended with the two of them by the fire, wrapped in each other's arms, knowing that the journey they had begun together was just the start of a life full of love, hope, and endless possibility. The brown wool gown, once a symbol of fear, now lay forgotten in the corner of their room, its purpose fulfilled. And in its place, Eleanor had found something far more precious. The freedom to love, to be loved, and to live a life filled with the promise of forever. Full resolution, next generation established, theme clearly stated, satisfying emotional closure.